Mr. President, I rise today to offer my support to the underlying legislation that we are considering on the floor today. This is the most significant anti-trafficking legislation to come before the United States Senate in over a decade. As I talked about earlier when I offered a couple of amendments, I'm very pleased to be in this body on a nonpartisan basis, not just a bipartisan basis, to be able to address this issue. And I want to thank the senators who have worked hard in their committees to make that possible. Senators Cornyn and Klobuchar for all their work. I see Senator Wyden is here, Senator Leahy is here, Senator Grassley is here, others who have been involved with this. They and their staffs are to be commended. This has been a good process in my view. It's an issue that a lot of us care about. And why? Because it's one that affects our states and our constituents in very significant ways. Last year, I co-founded and now co-chair the Caucus on Human Trafficking with Senator Blumenthal, and we've had a number of good meetings, conferences here on the Hill, bringing experts together, raising the awareness of this issue. Unfortunately, this horrible crime affects every single part of our country. In Ohio, this came to my attention initially because in parts of Ohio, along I-75 corridor, particularly in Toledo, there were higher incidences of prosecutions of human trafficking, and a school group actually brought this to my attention several years ago. And the more we looked into it, the more we realized that, again, this affects so many of our constituents, and particularly affects the most vulnerable in our society: children, runaways, the missing. In the greatest country in the face of the earth, almost 300,000 of our American children are at risk of trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation, more than 1,000 each year in Ohio alone. In 2000, I did support the last major bill to directly address this growing problem of human trafficking. It was called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. I also supported its reauthorization in 2011. But since that time, we've learned a lot more about the problem. We now know more about how to eradicate what is really a modern form of slavery. Our new legislation, which is called the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act of 2015, builds on what we know works, and it strengthens the protections for the victims. I'd like to take a moment, if I could, to talk about two of the bills that are contained within this underlying legislation that are the product of a lot of bipartisan work that exemplifies some of the finest traditions of this body. The first is the Bringing Missing Children Home Act. Bringing Missing Children Home Act is something that I co-authored with Senator Schumer on the other side of the aisle. And we did it because we know there is, unfortunately, this strong correlation between victims of sex trafficking and children who have recently been in and out of the child welfare system. We also know that children who have run away or are missing are the most vulnerable to be abused, trafficked, and exploited. In 2014, an FBI sting recovered 168 children who were victims of sex trafficking. Nearly each one of those children, nearly all of them, had been involved in some kind of foster care or the child welfare system. Many of them had been reported missing, and by the way, with insufficient information to find them. So it's a strong correlation, and it's one that any effort to stop human trafficking must also address. This is what my legislation does. Bringing Children Home strengthens law enforcement reporting and response procedures, making it easier to communicate and work with child welfare agencies. It accomplishes this in a number of ways. It amends the current Missing Children's Assistance Act so that federal law makes clear that children who are trafficked or sexually exploited are treated as victims and not as criminals. You'll hear this in this debate, and this is one of the great underlying aspects of this legislation, is we're changing the way we look at this, changing the paradigm to understand that there is simply no such thing as a child prostitute. Second, this legislation requires law enforcement to update their records of missing children within 30 days with all the relevant information obtained during the initial investigation. This is really important because this new information will allow us to find these children more easily and more quickly to avoid them falling into the trap of sexual trafficking and traffickers. Specifically, the bill requires that new dental and medical records be provided. But it also requires that law enforcement enter a photograph of the child if it is available. And for almost all of these children, there is a photograph available if you take the time to try to find it. I can't stress this last part enough. It is so hard to find these kids, and without having a photograph, it's made much more difficult. And yet, in most instances, apparently we don't. Now, we've tracked this in Ohio over the last several months, and let me just give you an interesting statistic. Since January 1st of this year, there have been 87 children reported missing in the state of Ohio. 87 kids. we only have photographs for 21 of them. So for 66 of these young people, we have no photograph. It's really tough to find them when you don't know what they look like. This bill will help change that. Third, it requires law enforcement to work directly with both state and local child welfare systems after someone is reported missing, so that all the relevant information can be obtained as quickly as possible. And finally, it removes all the roadblocks that prevent state attorneys general from modifying records in the National Crime Information Center. So we want these records to be updated constantly as new information is provided. To put it simply, we think it's a common sense bill that streamlines how cases of missing children are handled and makes it a lot easier to share the vital information that could lead to recovery. The second bill I want to talk about that's part of this underlying legislation is called the Combat Human Trafficking Act that I co-authored with Senator Feinstein. The Missing Children Home Act we talked about is about helping victims. This legislation, the Combat Human Trafficking Act, is about punishing the traffickers. We start by giving prosecutors expanded tools to put traffickers behind bars. Our legislation enlarges the number of charges federal prosecutors can level against traffickers and those who conspire with them. It also makes those engaged in trafficking strictly liable for their crimes. We also expand the training available for our federal law enforcement tasked with investigating and prosecuting traffickers, and we require that the Bureau of Justice Statistics prepare an annual report detailing our success in this fight. Just as importantly, this bill again strengthens victims' rights by providing more information to victims on ongoing prosecutions, requiring them to be informed in a timely manner of any plea agreements or deferred prosecution agreement in cases in which they're involved. Mr. President, the legislation we're considering, this underlying legislation, passed out of the committee unanimously for a reason. There are things that do divide us in this place, and we talk about those a lot, and everybody reads and hears about them. But this is an exception. This is about bringing us together, in this case to protect our kids from human trafficking. Human traffickers and sexual trafficking are issues where we should not have any divide. This is legislation that both Republicans and Democrats can enthusiastically support. Earlier today, I did join with some of my colleagues in introducing some amendments to the legislation because although I support the underlying bill, it's a good bill, it can even be made better. And I'm looking forward to the debate. And in the process, I hope that we will raise awareness of this issue, raise consciousness about the issue, not just here among our colleagues and here on Capitol Hill, but around the country. Because ultimately, we're going to solve this problem in our communities. Everyone needs to be part of it. Everyone needs to be vigilant. Everybody needs to understand that this happens in your community. It happens in your state, and it happens, unfortunately, in our country. If we can raise awareness about this horrific practice of human trafficking and sex trafficking, that will do a lot to try to curb it, to reduce it, and eventually to stop it. This is what we came to Washington to do, to pass legislation that actually helps back home. And with this legislation, we can stand together to protect the most innocent among us from the most heinous of crimes. I thank you, Mr. President, and I note the absence of a quorum.